Professor Ivlo Griffith, Senior Associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Fellow of Global Americans, and Founding Fellow Caribbean Policy Consortium. Ambassador Patrick Duddy, retired U.S. diplomat, Senior Advisor for Global Affairs at Duke University, and Fellow Caribbean Policy Consortium. Professor Jessica Byron, UWI Professor Emerita and Fellow, Caribbean Policy Consortium. Dr. Scott MacDonald, Chief Economist at Smith's Research and Gradings, Senior Advisor to Global American and Fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. Dr. Karen Niles, Lecturer, Institute of International Relations, and Coordinator, Climate Studies Program, 1 UWI Global Campus. On behalf of the Institute of International Relations, the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and the Caribbean Policy Consortium, a warm welcome to the webinar titled The 2024 U.S. Presidential Elections, Old Path or New Directions. My name is Anita Montut, Acting Director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and moderator of today's webinar. Please note the format of the webinar as follows. After my brief overview of the partners and opening remarks, the presenters will speak on the designated topic. This will be followed by a question and answer segment and finally, closing remarks. Please feel free to send your questions to the email address provided or in the chat feature on Zoom. Some brief information on the partners. The Institute of International Relations. Established in 1966, the Institute of International Relations, IIR, is a brainchild of Dr. Eric Williams, the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. The IIR is the Caribbean's premier postgraduate institution dedicated to conducting advanced research and teaching in the field of international relations for the purpose of building the capacity of the Caribbean region to navigate complex international challenges within the contemporary world system. The Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean was created in 2014 as a professional training arm of the Institute. The Caribbean Policy Consortium. Founded in 2020, the Caribbean Policy Consortium, CPC, is a body focused on analyzing Caribbean policy issues, supported by a network of policy and academic institutions in the Caribbean and North America. The CPC successfully forges international partnerships with the objective of widening initiatives geared towards advancing Caribbean policy interests. It accesses top-tier talent anchored by a core network of expertise and scholarship from North America and the Caribbean, and addresses the need to re-energize U.S. Caribbean engagement and identify a set of issue areas to do so. The CPC and the IIR have hosted many research and policy dialogues together, including on firearms trafficking and litigation, the Caribbean relations with Latin America, Guyana-Venezuela dispute, Caribbean perspectives on the Israeli-Palestine conflict, Africa-Caribbean engagement, Russian invasion of Ukraine, U.S.-Caribbean relations and governance and elections in the Caribbean. Note that the CPC and IIR have hosted numerous other seminars in collaboration with other entities. Before I introduce the first speaker, I would like to historicize and provide some broad context for this webinar. The relationship between the Caribbean and the U.S. has traditionally been seen to be a reflection of geopolitical shifts in the global political economy, from the bipolar distribution of power during the Cold War, followed by the unipolar moment characterized by U.S. hegemony, arguably in the first decade after the end of the Cold War, to a more recent multipolar world having a number of competing powers vying for global leadership. But while these frameworks are important for understanding the relationship between the two parties, it does not take into account the fact that states are not the only actors exercising power. Non-state actors are increasingly challenging the power of the state, as well as the fact that power is no longer restricted to the military, political, and economic realms. Moreover, the paradigms of realism and structuralism, which are predominantly being utilized to explain U.S. Caribbean engagement in terms of a dependent and unequal power dynamics, do not capture the complexity that characterizes relations between the two parties. Some say a more apt framework to explain the Caribbean-U.S. relationship is complex interdependence. Personally, I think this approach has a lot of merit. Notwithstanding the continued asymmetries in the relationship, politically and economically, this concept facilitates a more nuanced understanding of the relationship, seeing it as mutually impacting. Importantly, the approach gives the Caribbean some agency in the process. In other words, the Caribbean is not completely powerless, waiting to be rescued by the US, or the latter having absolute or unchallenged ability to hurt or sanction the region. Finally, while the traditional Republican-Democrat dichotomy is very useful, it has been proven to be insufficient to facilitate a deeper analysis of what the term of a particular US president would mean for the world and the Caribbean region. While the rhetoric and past actions of Donald Trump, example, shunning multilateralism and international cooperation, and unconventional diplomacy, and continuities in the global system, which by the way remains capitalist and asymmetrical, may give us some indication of what we should expect from another Trump term. At the same time, shifting global dynamics, new conflicts, actors' interests in the US and abroad, and importantly, evolving interests and lessons the Caribbean may have learned are all points to be considered in the analysis. One analyst termed the upcoming dispensation as a period of disorder. I leave it to the panelists to discuss what this all means for the Caribbean this time around. Having said that, I now introduce our first panelist, Ambassador Patrick Duddy. Ambassador Patrick Duddy, a retired U.S. diplomat, is senior advisor for global affairs at Duke University. He has taught at Duke's Fuqua School of Business and Sanford School of Public Policy, and served as the academic director of Duke's Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies. Duddy is a senior Latin American specialist with extensive experience in trade, energy, public affairs, and crisis management. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Venezuela from 2007 to 2010 and was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere. Duddy was the U.S. Consul General in Sao Paulo, Brazil from 2002 to 2005. He also served as a senior United States government liaison to the business community and as a board member of the American Chamber of Commerce in Sao Paulo. Duddy has held senior positions at U.S. embassies in Bolivia, Panama, Paraguay, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, and Chile. He has delivered lectures to various private sector groups, world affairs councils, NGOs, and universities in the U.S. and Latin America. Duddy has written for the Council on Foreign Relations, Center for Preventative Action, and published op-ed columns on U.S. foreign and trade policy. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Academy of Diplomacy. Ambassador Duddy will provide an overview by examining the U.S. in the world. What should we expect from a second Trump presidency?
Thank you very much. And it's good afternoon to all. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm happy to do my very best to give you a sense of what may be coming. That said, since we began planning for this webinar, I have been reaching out to colleagues both in the government and previously in the government, some from the Biden administration, others who have served previously with President Trump. And to some degree, by way of preamble, I want to stress that this is very early days. As recently as today at lunch, I met with the director for the Western Hemisphere, one of the major think tanks in Washington, and queried him on, in the first instance, who was waiting in the wings to assume senior positions within the Western Hemisphere. And this is still very much up in the air. And I think it is something that we should all watch carefully, as to some degree, appointments within the State Department, Treasury, Commerce, etc., will signal where the new administration wants to go, at least initially, within the hemisphere. Now, broadly speaking, we have all heard, I think, repeatedly during the recently concluded presidential campaign that the Trump administration will start with the goal of, or a set of goals: make America great again, make America healthy again, end what they characterize as the endless wars. And I think an initial agenda for the new administration will flow from those announced goals. An important one for the Western Hemisphere will, of course, be the new administration's concern with reestablishing control over the U.S. southern border and dealing with the very significant undocumented migrant population within the United States. So this is where we start. To that, I would add what has been the focus of the Biden administration in the Caribbean. I would suggest there have been essentially four major efforts: security, food security, energy, and climate. And of the four, it seems to me that climate has been a major element in much that the Biden administration has sought to do over the last 4 years. That said, the administration has attempted to engage both in Haiti, but also in dealing with the crisis in Venezuela and the related crisis of the outgoing migrant population. Unfortunately, as many of us know, the situation in Haiti continues to deteriorate. The effort to forge a multilateral assistance group, something other than a UN peacekeeping operation, has to date not succeeded. And the situation on the ground with the extraordinary activity of the Haitian gangs continues to concern, I think, North Americans on both sides of the political aisle. Similarly, there remains deep concern about Venezuela. And I think that going forward, we can expect that the new administration will inevitably focus on those issues, along with the U.S. border, the problems of deporting undocumented migrants without necessarily, or if you will, too seriously affecting our relations with our other neighbors within the hemisphere. We have already seen that there have been overtures to the new administration by Canada. I know that President Trump has spoken with President Sheinbaum of Mexico, and it may well be that these partners in the USMCA have managed to head off tariffs, but there are very big issues which will inevitably concern the new administration. Since there is no one actually yet named as the new Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere, I think we have to start, as we consider wither U.S.-Caribbean relations, with the notion that past may well be prologue, but not necessarily so. Right? Not necessarily so. A number of the former officials in the first Trump administration, to whom I have spoken in the last week or so, do confirm that inevitably given the prominence of the immigration issue in the campaign, initially in particular, immigration is going to be a big part of the new administration's initial efforts. But by the same token, I think I was recently reviewing some comments by former IDB president and Trump appointee Mauricio Claver Caron, and what he expects for the region, and I think he nails a number of things pretty convincingly. First of all, the new administration is likely to be very focused on economic issues, and specifically the link between what Washington considers to be national security and economic prosperity. In particular, I would say they embrace the notion that that economic prosperity and economic growth is good for the United States as well as for the region. With that in mind, I think it is interesting to note that what's called by way of shorthand, the Americas Act is something that seems to have bipartisan support in Washington. And what at least some of its advocates are hoping is that it will open up the possibility of a more robust kind of engagement, commercial engagement in the sub-region, up to and including creating a docking mechanism for Caribbean countries to plug into the USMCA. Now, what that would look like, with what limitations, because the region is likely to have its own strong concerns about docking with economies which are so very much larger than even the aggregate economies of the Caribbean. But still, that's a very positive thing. As many of our viewers know, the U.S. has, to some degree, effectively hobbled itself in engaging in the Caribbean in a couple of different ways. One is by requiring the Development Finance Corporation to restrict its activities to lower income countries, and much of the Caribbean falls into the category of middle income countries. I believe that there will be movement within, only a guess, of course, but I believe there will be movement within the new Trump administration in the context of the Americas Act to raise the ceiling so that the Development Finance Corporation can be more active in the Caribbean. One of the things that I would like to see is a decision by the United States to open more embassies and consulates in the sub-region. There are any number of countries in which we do not have a diplomatic presence. In some part, in some measure, if you will, because the growing influence of China concerns the United States, I think that an argument can be made, and I hope the argument is, if not initiated, certainly supported by the Caribbean, that U.S. Caribbean relations could be advanced by a more evident, a more substantial U.S. diplomatic presence in the region. In the meantime, I think that the U.S. is going to be looking for partners. In the first instance, I note that I think Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Jamaica, Antigua and Barbuda have all offered to commit at least modest numbers of either police or troops to the mission in Haiti. That will doubtless be, I'm sure that it will be the view of the Trump administration that is a positive thing. But I suspect that all of us on this program would acknowledge that it's going to take a major effort to reverse the deteriorating circumstances and situation in Haiti. And I suspect that's going to mean a more evident engagement by the United States. Again, I don't know quite what the form will be, but I think it's going to be important. Beyond that, I think the administration is going to be looking for people that want, or people, countries, states, organizations that want to work with the administration to energize the private sector, both in the U.S. and in the region. I'll finish there and pass the baton, if you will, to one of my colleagues.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that, for outlining the potential areas of focus of the U.S. Towards the Caribbean, and even providing some factors that may guide or drive or shape maybe some spaces or areas that the Caribbean could possibly leverage. You mentioned the introduction of China and the emergence of China in the Caribbean, how these could possibly shape the US's reaction and response to the Caribbean. So thank you very much for setting those broad areas and context for us. So we now move to our second presenter, Professor Jessica Byron-Reed. Professor Jessica Byron-Reed is UWI Professor Emerita and Honorary Professor at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies at UWI Mona. She served at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies for 23 years. She was subsequently appointed as Director of the Institute of International Relations at the UWI St. Augustine campus from August 2016 until her retirement in August 2022. Prior to her academic career, she was a Foreign Service Officer with the government of St. Kitts and Nevis and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. Byron-Reed has worked with various international research consortia and multilateral agencies on regional and global political, economic, and social issues. She's a member of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and an affiliate of the Resilient and Sustainable Island Initiative. She also serves on the Alumni Advisory Committee of the Graduate Institute of Geneva and previously served as a Caribbean member of the Committee on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches. Professor Byron will address Caribbean perspectives on some global and regional issues in the wake of the U.S. election results. Professor Byron.
Well, that was a sterling beginning. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. My focus today is a Caribbean perspective on both our interests and our concerns as the United States government changes guard to a second presidential term for Donald Trump. Now, we are inexorably located squarely within the immediate and sensitive geopolitical sphere of the United States. The United States is our largest economic and security partner. It wields tremendous socio-political and cultural influence in the daily dynamics of all of our societies. This is both a tremendous opportunity and also presents various types of challenges now and then. Now, the term intermestic politics was coined many years ago to convey the interplay of domestic and international elements in this US-Caribbean relationship. Our region retains somewhat turbulent memories of Donald Trump's first presidential term. And for some regional actors, it resulted in extremely negative political, social, and economic outcomes. So what is the global, multilateral, and world order picture viewed from the perspective of a Caribbean small state as the Trump administration prepares to take office in January 2025? Somewhat somber and a bit threatening in some ways, although there are opportunities. The two of the most important perspectives would be that there are escalating security risks internationally and also regionally. And there are also escalating existential risks posed by climate-related disasters and threat of future pandemics. Now, Caribbean small island developing states are striving to rebuild after successive shocks ever since 2008 or even before, and to access the flexibility and benefits of a multipolar world with many possibilities for new partnerships and development. But these scenarios are giving way to a tightening global environment with a shifting world order in which the United States appears to view the Caribbean and South America purely in the prism of strategic competition with China and ongoing conflict with Russia and migrant invasions of over the United States borders. There is an increasing trend towards decoupling the Chinese economic zone from the Western economic zone. None of this is encouraging for Caribbean small island developing states or for Latin America and the Caribbean. Such trends were already visible during the outgoing US administration, and we think that they may gather momentum during the forthcoming one, at least according to the emerging list of officials who have been named and some of the priority agenda items that have been mentioned. So I want to just look firstly at a couple of scenarios in terms of multilateral and bilateral diplomacy. First, at the global multilateral level. Now, generally, small states feel that they gain from a global environment which has stable, functioning institutions that provide security guarantees, humanitarian protection, development assistance, and strong international legal norms. Presently, many multilateral institutions are severely weakened and lacking in resources to respond effectively to crises across the globe. Also, we are seeing attempts or threats to keep rolling back sort of pillars of the international legal order that happen to be very important to small developing countries. It is unlikely that the incoming Trump administration will provide much political or financial support, either for the UN system or for regional networks, based, if one is to go on the record of the first term and on the pronouncements made concerning the use of tariffs, withdrawal threats, etc., from certain organizations, not only humanitarian bodies, but the World Trade Organization, for example, seems set for a very difficult time. Similarly, one may anticipate challenges for regional organizations. In the past, we have seen attempts to ignore their relevance and to use alternative ad hoc groupings where possible. CARICOM experienced this to a certain extent during the former administration. One may also anticipate growing pressures on Caribbean small states who are interested in expanding their development cooperation programs and investments with China. China has become an important partner to many countries in this region, not just in the Caribbean, but also in Latin America. The pressure has been the case in the past, but without always being accompanied by funding opportunities on a similar scale to that of China to meet the myriad physical, social, and economic infrastructural needs of Caribbean cities. What is uncertain at present is whether the trends to increase, another thing, and Ambassador Duddy mentioned this, there have been trends and proposals to increase US diplomatic representation in the Caribbean. This was welcomed, but it is uncertain if it will continue and whether there will be a speedy transition in ambassadorial appointments, or rather extremely long drawn out transitions as happened in 2017 to 2020. This is an important question because it touches on the communication channels between Caribbean governments and societies and their US counterparts. Now, I want to just mention the existential theme of climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. My colleague, Dr. Niles, is going to focus centrally on this. But suffice it for me to say that this is one of the most critical global, regional, and national policy issues for every Caribbean small island developing state. We are currently grappling with the twists and turns of constructing more environmentally sustainable and climate resilient societies. And it is extremely disturbing to all of us to hear the cries of drill, baby, drill coming from our giant neighbor next door. Caribbean countries will continue to explore the most effective ways to continue advancing our sustainable development goals and agendas. Similarly, I don't want to encroach too much on my colleague Scott's area, except to say that economic statecraft is going to be of the highest importance for the Caribbean in the coming years, statecraft and research. With all this brandishing of tariff threats, threatening of tariff wars, because we will have to brace for inflationary pressures and supply chain issues. And we also think there may be a revisiting of CBI and of the CBTPA if, as has been mentioned, there is a general revisiting of the United States free trade agreements with countries and regions in the hemisphere. Now, for most Caribbean countries, while merchandise trade with the United States is dominated by the Southern Caribbean and it's mostly in hydrocarbons, for the rest of us, it is concentrated, trade is concentrated in services, for example, and especially tourism-related services. Now, I am not clear on how those would be affected by tariff threats. Scott would probably be the person to enlighten us if there is that possibility. But I do recall that a different initiative during the last Trump administration, different kind of initiative but related to finance, in which there was a proposal to place a tax on migrant remittances from the United States, which would have had repercussions, negative repercussions for some Caribbean countries and their citizens. Now, let me turn to other regional and national issues. The first, of course, is migration. Most Caribbean countries will be affected in one form or another if there is a major campaign to remove irregular, undocumented migrants from the United States. The most vulnerable people are said to be the DACAs or dreamers, people who were born in the United States or came there as very young children, the spouses of US citizens, and those with temporary protected status. Caribbean countries, in my view, may well need to assume that this is going to be the case and to reinforce their consular personnel and posts in the United States so that they can extend support where possible to affected nationals and be able to engage adequately with the US authorities, particularly on the question of children who may be affected in any such migration exercises. The home countries should also be focusing on boosting their reception services of one type or another for nationals who summarily find themselves deported and in precarious circumstances when they return to their countries of origin. Governments will be focused on ensuring that this does not become a new type of destabilizing current in their societies. That is a very real scenario, which I imagine our countries would be preparing to address. But there is another type of spillover effect of migration responses from the United States. Migrants from other regional countries will also be expelled. Many of them may be searching for new safe havens in this region, and the migratory pressures on the US border may well be transferred to other borders in the Caribbean zone. I remember that after the last summit of the Americas, the Biden administration negotiated some agreements with countries in Central America on receiving migrants from some countries and accommodating them there. Excuse me. This leads me to my final remarks concerning Haiti, Cuba, and Venezuela. It seems very clear that in all three cases, the next US presidential term may be extremely difficult for the societies concerned, with many repercussions also for their Caribbean neighbors. The potential top officials who will be dealing with these cases and issues seem to be very hardline in their utterances up to this point. The breakdown of any of these societies is not in the interest of Caribbean countries. CARICOM countries have common positions vis-a-vis Cuba. Cuba is seen as a friendly and generously cooperative neighbor with whom they have developed deep-seated historical ties of solidarity. Consultation and statecraft will be needed to be deployed on how to continue to support the Cuban state and society in tangible economic and social ways, and to respect Cuba's sovereignty on decisions, internal decisions. Excuse me. On the question of Venezuela, CARICOM may be somewhat more divided, but there has been unanimity on two themes. Well, three, I should say. The economic sanctions imposed by the Obama and Trump administrations have severely hurt the Venezuelan population and contributed to the outflow of 7 million people. That is not totally due to them, but also to domestic situations. And this outflow has possibly removed much of the domestic political opposition. Two, we support negotiation and the honoring of free and fair electoral results. And third, CARICOM is united in its support for Guyanese territorial integrity. Now, some Caribbean and Latin American countries continue to bear the brunt of Venezuela's migrant outflow and are hosting large numbers of refugees. I want to draw reference to the Dutch Caribbean countries, to Trinidad, and to others who are very concerned by the possibility of much stronger sanctions being deployed against Venezuela. We all have an interest in participating with other LAC actors, the US, the EU, Canada, in dialogue towards the resolution and a return to democratic governance and societal reconstruction. Madam Moderator, I'm wrapping up. In Haiti, we are in similar migrant hosting situations in smaller numbers. The CARICOM Haitian group continues to meet and work with the Dominican Republic and others, but without much progress. It is true, as Ambassador Duddy said, that a number of countries are willing to provide troops and other workers to assist in peacekeeping together with Kenya. But also, CARICOM needs to intercede with other countries on the Security Council, including China and Russia, to overcome the hurdles involved in mounting a full-fledged multilateral force to restore order and humanitarian relief to Haiti. Our efforts alone are not going to suffice. Diplomatic initiatives in the OAS are also very important. The Caribbean is and will continue to engage fully in that respect. I will stop here and engage in the discussion that follows. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Byron, for laying out the changes or the initiatives that we could expect in global governance, as well as in U.S. domestic politics, and how these could directly and indirectly impact the Caribbean. We are thankful and grateful for some of the recommendations you made to us as to how we can overcome this as individual countries, but also as a CARICOM bloc, and also for bringing in the non-English speaking Caribbean. So thank you for that, Professor Byron. And at this point, I want to remind listeners and attendees of this webinar that they should feel free to send their questions via email, the email address provided, as well as the chat feature in Zoom. So having said that, we return to the presentations. So our third presenter is Professor Ivlo Griffith. A founding fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium, Ivlo Griffith is also Senior Associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a fellow with Global Americans. He has published widely on Caribbean affairs, including 10 scholarly books, the latest being Challenge Sovereignty. He's also published a novel, Sylvie's Love and Loss. Professor Griffith is the recipient of the Dr. William J. Perry Award for Excellence in Security and Defense Education, named in honor of former U.S. Defense Secretary in 2015. He has served as Vice Chancellor of the University of Guyana, President of Fort Valley State University in Georgia, Provost of University in Virginia, New York, and as Dean of Florida International University in Miami. Professor Ivlo Griffith will interrogate the question, the U.S. presidential elections, a new dawn for Caribbean security. Professor Griffith, over to you.
Thank you for the generous introduction, Dr. Montoute, and good evening to all colleagues. Glad you're able to join us here. Whether we're talking about the United States or any other nation state, governance changes in the leadership of the society often presents an opportunity for what I call a reality check in foreign policy, in areas of domestic policy. In the case of United States contemporary realities, I think reality checks are even more crucial given the Trump administration's understandably expected hyper unorthodoxy in the Trump 2.0 presidency. Whenever I think of reality check, my mind goes back to a distinguished English statesman, Anthony Eden, served not only as prime minister, but also as foreign minister of the United Kingdom and Great Britain for a while. And Anthony Eden said something in the 1950s. He was talking about Britain and the European continent. What he said there is this, it's quite appropriate for the conversation today. He said, there is nothing more dangerous than a foreign policy based on unreality. What Anthony Eden was recommending is reality checks being appropriate, actually necessary when you're going to craft a new policy. And if you have a change in administration, whether there's going to be a modification of policy or an entirely new policy, I submit that reality checking is an appropriate thing to do. So I want to conduct the reality checking in regard to a Trump 2.0 in the security arena vis-a-vis the Caribbean mindful of a proposition made by a Nobel laureate, also from the European part of the world, Bertrand Russell. And in the context of embracing Russell, I want to ask that we hang question marks on these three areas. What might be a conceptual construct we can use in doing the reality checking in regard to the Trump second presidency? I think a second important question is, what are some critical elements in the context of this conceptual construct, which we'll come to see is what I'm recommending the whirlpool construct we embrace? What are some of the critical elements in the context of that construct that are inescapable as we look to do the reality checking for Trump 2.0 in the Caribbean? And I want to leave with us a third, hopefully we'll get to address this question. How might Caribbean countries navigate this whirlpool in the new political dispensation given the advent of a presidency by President Trump in his second iteration? So let's go to the first question. What might be a conceptual construct? There's a very distinguished late scholar who I want to invoke in recommending that his conceptual construct is the one that might be appropriate for us to use. And the scholar to whom I'm referring is a guy called Robert Pastor, friend of some of us in this webinar presentation panel. And Robert Pastor wrote a couple of books, among other things that he did, articles and scholarly presentations, where he recommended that a construct we might use, and I want to recommend that we use it in this case, to look at the United States in the Latin American Caribbean context, is what he called a whirlpool. And I just want to read you one very long, actually 2 sentences, the proposition about whirlpool as a construct that Robert Pastor made. One pattern that stands out is the way in which United States attention to the region fluctuates between obsession and disinterest. I have referred to this pattern as the whirlpool, says Robert Pastor, a whirling eddy which occasionally sucks the United States into a vortex of crisis, where it becomes preoccupied by small Caribbean nations or their leaders. I'm recommending that we keep in mind and apply the construct of a whirlpool in helping to do the reality checking in regard to the United States. But I think before we go to the second question, I want to offer a couple of footnotes in regard to the notion of the conceptual construct. I think a second Trump presidency in the Caribbean, as it is likely to be for other parts of the world, is likely to have an inclination to being transactional and not necessarily based on national policy or national interests. We've seen that evidence in the first Trump presidency. We've seen that evidence in the campaigning. The likelihood, I think, is reasonable to assume that a transactional approach will be featured in this whirlpool arrangement. I think we're also likely to see selective bilateralism. Connected to the transactional arena is how might particular Caribbean countries be selected for a bilateral rather than dealing with the region as a whole. And again, this is evidence, there is evidence of this in regard to the first Trump presidency, a famous case of selecting Jamaica and dealing with Jamaica and a few other countries rather than trying to embrace. So I think in the whirlpool construct that we're looking at, I recommend we keep in mind the likelihood that bilateralism on a selective basis is likely to characterize the engagement with the region. But keep in mind what Trump said during the campaign. I am your warrior. I am your retribution. And I think it is practical for us to recommend, for me to recommend, that I would not be surprised if Vice President Harris's connection to the Caribbean isn't used against the Caribbean in the I am your warrior, I am your retribution mode. But before I go to the next slide, let me also remind us that the Caribbean falls within the construct of this S-hole countries that Trump talked about during his first presidency. And let us not remember that part of the campaign focus was on Springfield, Ohio, that significantly involved citizens from one Caribbean country that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So, what in the context of this whirlpool might be some critical elements that are inescapable? Time does not permit a long discourse on possible elements, but I want to identify 4, even if only to mention them, but not necessarily discuss them in detail because of time constraints. I want to recommend that part of the whirlpool, some of the elements that are beyond being escapable, are not, that will always be on the whirlpool: ED, CBSI, arms trafficking, Haiti, and geopolitics, for me, are part of this whirlpool, critical, inescapable elements. I've been taking particularly keen interest on the CBSI ever since I testified in Congress in 2010, when President Obama sent the proposal for CBSI to Congress for funding. And just as a reminder, the notion of the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative was itself announced in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, in 2009 at the Summit of the Americas. We know that, of course, there was a kind of an addendum in 2017 when the US strategy for engagement was firstly announced and then incorporating the CBSI. And CBSI is the overarching umbrella for security engagement in the Caribbean. It's important to take a look in regard to the CBSI at what was some of the evidence of Trump's earlier action. And part of my concern about the robustness of the engagement through CBSI is connected to how President Trump's administration conducted its business with the Caribbean using the CBSI. I wrote a book a couple of months ago that was released a couple of months ago, and I detail in a part of the chapter that looks at the final part of the portrait I was painting. I took the trouble to explain some of the funding priorities and how the CBSI during the Trump 1 presidency suffered from cutbacks in funding. As a matter of fact, had it not been to some actual congressional lobbying and the restoration of some of the funding by Congress, the CBSI under Trump would have fared even worse. You don't have to spend a lot of time on this graph, table 8.1 in the book I'm referring to, where you can see CBSI was not a major issue for Trump in the first presidency, and my suspicion is it's not likely to fare well in the second presidency. Connected to the CBSI concerns, another critical area in this whirlpool is the issue of arms trafficking. Arms trafficking is part of the sobering reality of the nexus between the Caribbean and the United States. In the last few months, there were 2 significant reports dealing with this relationship between the United States and the Caribbean with regard to arms trafficking. One by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and one by the Government Accountability Office. And you don't have to read too deep into these reports to see the clear and present dangers to the Caribbean of this issue of arms trafficking. And my worry is about the funding slashes that Trump announced he will make policy pursuit in the second presidency, particularly given the fact that he was not too big on CBSI. My worry is that in regard to arms trafficking, we're likely to see some strains in the security relationship because the funding and support is likely not to be there. you get a sense of the challenge with regard to arms trafficking, and I share here two graphic representations, one from the CSIS report and one from the US GAO analysis that gives you a sense of the connectivity between the region and the United States, where the sources of the problems are and the scope of the arms trafficking saga. But let's move quickly because time is passing us by. I want to share with you two sentences, just two sentences from people who have written on the issue of Haiti, and there's a lot of written about Haiti and Haiti-US connections. A sentence from a friend of mine has my same name, Ivelaw Griffith, in a book called Challenge Sovereignty. Haiti is undoubtedly the region's most dramatic case of challenge sovereignty because of the combined effects of political instability, economic destitution, out of control crime and violence, feuding gangs and kidnappings. But I want to recommend, if you have not read as yet, read another friend of mine, George Fariol, sobering assessment just last month in a piece that deals with 4 questions of Haiti. It's what George said in one powerful part of that report. The political appetite for continued US engagement in Haiti will be shaped partly by the worsening security and humanitarian situation and its ramifications for US immigration and refugee politics. What Professor Byron was talking about, intermestic, part of what George Fariol is saying here is part of the landscape for future engagement on the Haiti issue vis-a-vis US Caribbean security arrangement would have to do with the realities of United States domestic environment. And so, as others have said, Professor Byron, Ambassador Duddy, the likelihood that there'll be diminution of support is there. It's strains with regard to the security arrangement regarding Haiti are likely to be there going forward. But let me come to the final area, and that is the geopolitics. And I want to put the geopolitics, we can say much more, but I want to put it in 2 categories. I want to spend some time just talking about the energy geopolitical connection regarding United States and Guyana. I'm writing a book on oil and climate change in Guyana right now, and I want to share with you some of the data I've assembled in that study. Here are some of the known knowns, and maybe to some colleagues, these are also likely to be known unknowns. Guyana has a significant deposit of hydrocarbons, 11 billion barrels equivalent of oil, and 16 trillion cubic feet of gas. Significant there geopolitically, geoeconomically. But it's important to recognize that the kind of oil Guyana has is not only less costly to produce, partly because it's light and sweet. We can see later on, talk later on what that means. But hear this, the United States is at the top of the list of countries that consumes most of the oil coming out of Guyana. Just 1 year, 2023. If you ask which were the 6 countries that got most of Guyana's oil, top of the list is United States. Followed, as you see in that graphic, followed by the Netherlands, by Germany, by Brazil, France, and the United Kingdom. But it is not only where the product of Guyana's oil extraction is heading, it's also who are the investors in Guyana's oil enterprise. Significant investment by ExxonMobil, by Hess, which is going to be acquired by Chevron. Those are the leading, along with the Chinese company, the leading investors in the exploration and extraction. China is also there with its CNOOC company. But when we mention China, I want to transition now into the second geopolitical dimension, something mentioned by both Professor Byron and Ambassador Duddy. China's growing interest, investment, connectivity to the Caribbean is likely to be a basis for United States security relationships with the Caribbean. Just this morning, one of the local dailies in Guyana, the Stabroek News, had a major report reporting a seminar last Thursday where the outgoing Chinese ambassador to Guyana was proudly explaining that China's trade with Guyana grew by 31% the first half year of this calendar year. And if you have a sense on the right-hand side of the slide of the areas in the Caribbean, and this is a dated slide, 2 years old, significant investment. And I want to recommend that part of the conversation about geopolitics will be a conversation about China, not only in regard to Guyana's oil industry, but beyond oil, beyond Guyana. The bottom slide is a recent conversation between the Chinese foreign minister and the Caribbean, countries in the Caribbean that have relations with China, convening a conversation about how the relationship might be accentuated. So let me move quickly to the final question. And I may just mention the issue areas we may not have time to discuss them. I think the final question I'd like to recommend that we consider is, how might Caribbean countries navigate this whirlpool in the context of a Trump 2.0 presidency? And I recommend that there are 3 imperatives that the region needs to be considering. The region needs to resist the inclination for the bilateralism. It needs to embrace a collective imperative. Stick together. Resist the inclination to be taking one off here, one off there, what I call a collective imperative. I think a second imperative is for the Caribbean to leverage its significant diaspora. A lot of lobbying, a lot of negotiating, a lot of creating public space for pursuit can be done by the diaspora. Some countries do, but I think as a collective enterprise, as a way of dealing with this whirlpool, Caribbean countries would do well to use the diaspora in significant, meaningful ways. And I think finally, what I call the public diplomacy imperative. A few Caribbean countries have lobbying entities in Washington, D.C. They need to accentuate that lobbying diplomacy, need to invest in enabling the conversations not only with the executive branch, but with the legislative branch. So many states in the United States have significant diaspora representation. Those people vote for Congress people. They vote for governors. They vote for mayors. Public diplomacy from the Caribbean side needs to be pursued in that respect. So let me end with some final thoughts along the following lines. First, Caribbean leaders need to be proactive in relation to the Trump team, not only in regard to defining their collective interests, but also articulating and pursuing those shared interests. And I want to end with a quote, 2 sentences from Robert Pastor, one of his books, Exiting the Whirlpool. The United States is both a solution and a problem. It is a source of aid and a rival. It's an outlet for unskilled labor and a magnet for the region's talent. This reality will not change, I want to recommend, but how the management of that whirlpool relationship is undertaken is left both to the Caribbean and into the United States. I'll stop there.
Keith, thank you very much, Professor Griffith, for proposing this conceptual framework within which we can understand the relationship between the U.S., the whirlpool concept, and for situating the various factors or elements that we need to consider, the transactional nature of the policies that we should expect that might result in bilateralism, and for outlining how we can counteract that collectively. Thank you for emphasizing that and for reinforcing the point that, and which I said in my introduction, that it is a two-way relationship. It's certainly not one way, and there are opportunities as well as challenges. So having said that, we move to our fourth presenter, Dr. Scott B. McDonald. Dr. Scott B. McDonald is the chief economist at Smith's Research and Gradings, a fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and senior advisor to Global Americans. He has worked for the U.S. Office of the Comptroller, 3 international financial companies, and taught courses in political science at the University of Connecticut, Manhattanville University, and St. Thomas Aquinas College. His areas of expertise include U.S. and global economics and finance, climate change and energy transition, and in the Caribbean and Latin America. His MA was obtained from the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies in the area of Asian Studies, and his PhD is from the University of Connecticut in political science. His interest in the Caribbean has been long-standing, his latest book being The New Cold War, China and the Caribbean with Palgrave Macmillan, 2022. He's working on a new book, Sun, Sand, and Oil in the Caribbean, Energy Transition, Cooperations and Economic Statecraft. Dr. McDonald will speak on the potential impacts of the U.S. presidential elections on Caribbean economies and energy security. Over to you, Dr. McDonald.
Oh, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to say 2 things to start off with. I appreciate the University of West Indies Institute of International Relations and the Caribbean Policy Consortium for having this very interesting webinar. And it's an honor to be part of such a distinguished group of individuals in discussing Caribbean affairs. What I'm going to try to do today, perhaps, is to provide a little better context from the U.S. side and what is coming down the turnpike for the Caribbean and for the rest of the world. I would say that one of the most immediate impacts of the election and the incoming Trump 2.0 administration is uncertainty. People in the Caribbean have uncertainty. Well, guess what? People here in the United States have uncertainty as well. What was thrown out during the presidential campaign is not exactly what you're going to get in terms of real policies. A lot of it was thrown out in terms of setting a stage for negotiations, appealing to domestic audiences, and some of it, yes, real policy. So what do we know? Well, what we know and have in front of us is the past 2 administrations in the United States have turned much more towards protectionism. When Donald Trump came into office, the first thing that he did was to kill the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He went on to impose tariffs on China, aluminum and steel. He also pushed very hard to restructure the NAFTA and create the USMCA, which doesn't really roll off the tongue as well as NAFTA. And at the same time, he pushed very hard for America first, and it had a certain resonance within the American political system of a population which parts of were, as Trump would say, they were losers in globalization, and there was a high degree of frustration, and he spoke to them. So that helped push his policies forward. Many of Trump's 1.0 policies and protectionism were maintained by the Biden administration, and there's a certain degree of overlap in the preference of appealing to workers over the U.S. consumer. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later. But now, Donald Trump is not even in office, and he's stirring the pot. He's proposed a 60% tariff on China, or something along those lines. He threw out a 25% on all goods coming out of Canada and Mexico, a 10 to 20% range of tariffs for the rest of the world. And then there's the threat that if any country de-dollarizes, as with the BRICS, there would be 100% tariffs on their goods. What is coming down the road is potentially radical. It is disruptive, and it's very driven by U.S. inward politics. If it works, it will restructure the US economy and it will make it stronger and more competitive. But it's a disruptive process. And one of the other factors I want to mention is Trump did not come out of thin air. It's very easy here to discuss that, if you voted for Trump, you were an idiot. You lived in the great heartland, you didn't live on the coast, and you're unsophisticated and stupid. Well, Trump won the popular vote and he crushed Harris in the Electoral College. He believes that he has a popular mandate, and a lot of people that voted for him obviously agree with that. So, what does this new administration want to bring? And there are differences between Trump 1.0 and 2.0. I would say the most important is that there's a game plan here and there are people being put into places. Ambassador Duddy mentioned it's too early. It is. We have the sort of general outlines of what's coming down the road. One thing that's very, very important to understand is that with the Trump team, there's a desire to restructure the US economy away from a heavy dependence on corporate and individual income taxes to one where the federal government receives a larger part of its revenues from tariffs. And this was the US system for the 19th and early 20th century, but that allows for tax cuts, an extension of the 2017 US income tax cuts, as well as providing the groundwork for a cut of corporate taxes from 21% to 15%. Tariffs also, from the perception of the Trump team, they help onshoring of key US strategic sectors, and they elevate the US worker over the consumer. And by that, I mean you're bringing jobs back on shore. That is one of the sales points here that's very important. So tariffs in a collective mind within, I think, a lot of the Trump world equal American jobs and turbocharged economic growth. As I think Professor Griffith said, trade is going to be more transactional. It's going to be used to achieve political objectives. And we've already seen Trump's nudging of Mexico over the issues of migration and fentanyl trafficking into the United States. So what does all this mean for the Caribbean? I'm going to be very broad here. A lot of my colleagues before me have highlighted certain points, but there's going to be a radical change from the Biden administration to the Trump administration in terms of language and what is desired to be achieved. What was instructive to me was in October 2024, the US Trade Rep, Catherine Tay, spoke to her CARICOM colleagues. And reading through the official statement, she gave her reassurance of the importance of CBI as the backbone of US Caribbean trade relations, but she emphasized that we share an inclusive trade and investment agenda aimed at benefiting the most disadvantaged segments of society. What I found interesting as well in this was that there was no mention of CARICOM concerns. And by that, I mean the region's concerns over its growing trade deficit with the United States, CARICOM's interest in expanding CBI coverage to services, unfair competition from Puerto Rican rum, and a need to further push or to grow nearshoring and BPO business process outsourcing opportunities. Tay's readout for the USTR in many ways represents the Trump's approach to the Caribbean. That was often seen through the perceptual lens of green, which was climate change, renewable energy, helping to finance as it could, as well as gender and race. You're not going to get any of that with the Trump administration. That dynamic has flipped. Trump is going to be very different. Geopolitics are going to be more important over economics in many cases. The China factor, we've discussed it, the other speakers, it's a big factor. China has had very astute economic statecraft. It is China Inc., and they've done a great job in terms of appearing in the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, but they offer a package of goodies. At the same time, Cuba and Venezuela loom very large. I think you're going to see economic tightening that's going to occur on both of those countries by the Trump administration. CAFTA DR is going to be interesting as a trade agreement in large part. Nicaragua has definitely veered further to the left. You have a family dynasty being established with the Ortega family. And at the same time, President Castro in Honduras has also moved her country to the left. I don't know how that's going to work out in terms of that trade agreement, but it raises big questions, at least to me. I think you're going to see a return to some of the language that was built up around America Crece, which ideas which focus on public-private approach to infrastructure, especially power, but without as much verbiage about climate change or vulnerable communities. I would say, a sort of quick overview of to take it down to the next level. One is trade and tariffs. Obviously, this has been caught by the press. Everybody is focused on it now. I will say, I'll go out on a limb and say things could be more positive for CARICOM with the US tariff restructuring than it certainly is going to be with China, Canada, Mexico, Europe, and India. The US has enjoyed a long-term balance of trade surplus with CARICOM. I think in 2023, it was around $7.4 billion. Part of what Mr. Trump likes to look at are balance of trade. And if you have a big surplus with the US, you show up on the radar screen. If you don't, well, then you maybe don't show up on the radar screen. So maybe CARICOM, the other aspect of that, so maybe CARICOM concerns about Puerto Rican rum, extending CBI to services and other points to could make some headway. That is yet to be seen, but there could be some leeway for movement on those issues. A second point, aid. US aid to CARICOM countries is disproportionate in terms of who gets what. In 2023, I think the total that CARICOM got from the US was $456 million. Of that, guess who got the most money? Haiti did. Haiti got around 399 million of it. The rest of CARICOM, you got 62 million, which is, very small. And I think the issue that you sit here in terms of policy talk and people and personalities, we've all heard of the Doge, right? The Department of Government Efficiency being pushed by Elon Musk. And part of that is they want to make cuts in the US budget of $500 billion a year for the next 4 years. That's $2 trillion to be cut. And if any of that takes place, it's certainly going to put pressure on US aid for projects. Tax rates are also something which I think will merit attention. And tax rates do from the standpoint, if Trump takes corporate taxes from 21 to 15%, it raises issues for corporate tax rates in the Caribbean. Will you move to lower some of the corporate tax rates to stay competitive? But if you do that, then you run into the issue of the OECD and the desire of many European countries to keep corporate tax rates high. So that's another issue that's going to sit out there. The other issue, we've mentioned deportation of migrants, as well as taxation of remittances. Those issues could certainly hurt the Caribbean, but they need to be fleshed out. And to go back to Ambassador Duddy's comment, it's really early, but those are things that have to be watched. Probably the biggest point on the radar screen in the Caribbean for the incoming Trump team is the Southern Caribbean energy matrix. And by that, I mean Suriname, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, maybe Grenada with its latest discovery of gas fields. And, that boils down to, as I think Professor Griffith mentioned before me, big oil in the US big oil companies from the US, ExxonMobil, Hess, soon to be Chevron in Guyana, Apache, which is also now called APA, in Suriname, along with France's Total Energies. There's investment there. This is a point of US economic concern. Guyana, probably Suriname, they're important to Europe for oil. Going forward, oil and natural gas, they will play a more strategic role in that aspect, but the US also partakes of that bounty that's occurred there. And I mean, one of the more interesting things that always has occurred to me is that during cold winters, when there's problems getting natural gas in the United States, the city of Boston, which is very green and proud of it, they get their natural gas from Trinidad. So it does play an important role in the US economy. And the third point is new Cold War mentality. Trump 1.0 talked about it. Biden administration moved away from that terminology. Trump 2.0, it's going to be back. This is geopolitical competition. China is actively engaged in the Southern Caribbean. CNOOC is involved in Guyana. The trade picture Professor Griffith mentioned in Guyana, China has grown. And China is also the largest sovereign creditor to Suriname. And they just went through a very painful restructuring, and the Chinese dragged it out forever. But it provides leverage. And the last point that's important for the Caribbean in general, but goes to energy security, the US needs the Caribbean to be politically stable and economically viable. It's important from the standpoint of how the Caribbean fits into the American, I would say, the America's economic jigsaw. And that is ports, harbors, strategic trade routes, entrance and departure out of the Panama Canal. All those things count, and they do make a special niche for the Caribbean in terms of its economic importance to the US. I'd mention one more thing in terms of the Southern Energy Matrix is Southern Caribbean Energy Matrix, the Dragon Field, which Trinidad and Tobago shares with Venezuela. You might see more flexibility with that because Shell's involved, as well as Trinidad's oil company, and Venezuela, PDVSA. So we'll see what happens there, but that's another item that sits on the agenda. I was going to say, to wrap things up, economic statecraft and patience have never been more important and critical. There will be some testing of the guardrails. We're back to a hard-nosed realpolitik in global affairs and economics. There's a brave new world driven by self-interest, the shift away from multilateralism, more to unilateralism, America first. Recently, I heard Europe first. It's in some ways, my mind of thinking, it kind of returns us back to the 1930s. Smoot-Hawley tariff, Germany's autarky, all those things that's one of the worries that I have if the guardrails are tested and fail. Trump's chessboard is dominated by the US, China, Russia, India, Europe. These are powers to be contained, beaten, and played off against each other in a zero-sum logic. CARICOM will need to find a distinctive role, drawing on areas of historic strength to avoid being marginalized and exposed. The mantra here with speakers before me, and I fully agree with this, is unity is the key. If you allow the unity of CARICOM to be dismantled, you're weaker when you go to the bargaining table. And unity and collective action, as Professor Griffith said earlier, if you want to extract what CARICOM wants, it's going to have to use the collective action because you're running into choppy waters. And that's where I'll end off.
Wow, thank you, Dr. McDonald, for that, for being so real and so practical with us, showing us the areas that we need to focus on and the reality of what is out there. It's brutal, but it's true, and also for reinforcing what the other presenters have said in this harsh and brutal environment that you have described to us in terms of our economies. We can't do this alone, and the bilateralism and the transactional approach that we should expect, we need to revisit that very, very seriously in this dispensation. Thank you very much for that. And I want to continue to remind, we have some questions, but we're encouraging some more, although time is running out. But you never know if we could get to your questions. So feel free to post questions or send them in the email. Send it to the email provided as well as in the chat feature on the Zoom if you are on Zoom. So we now move on to our final presenter, Dr. Karen Niles. Dr. Niles is currently a lecturer at the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. Prior to that appointment, he was employed as the Business Unit Manager for Research and Policy at the Economic Development Advisory Board of Trinidad and Tobago. He was directly responsible for the production of briefs that sought to outline the steps required to facilitate a sustainable green economy transition in Trinidad and Tobago. He has previously served as a visiting fellow in the Department of Physics at the University of Otago, New Zealand. His research focused on mechanisms and policies necessary to facilitate a transition to renewable electricity generation in small island developing states in the Caribbean and the Pacific in order to enhance the capacity to mitigate and adapt to climate change and peak oil. As a certified youth worker and a published poet, Dr. Niles has been involved in international outreach projects in Guyana, Suriname, Haiti, and Kenya. He holds a bachelor's degree in government with minors in history and international relations from the University of the West Indies and a master's degree in international law from the University of Aberdeen. Dr. Niles will examine the implications of the U.S. presidential elections and global environmental climate politics for the Caribbean. Dr. Niles?
I'm going to dive right in. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to the amazing contributions of all the other speakers. I want to dive right in and begin by laying the groundwork. I'm going to speak about several important axes. As a matter of fact, I'm going to limit myself in the time that I have to speak about 3 important axes. The first, I'm recovering from a cold, so you have to forgive my voice. But the first important axis is going to be climate change, because it's an existential threat for the Caribbean region, right? And the US government is about to be led by someone who has signaled their intention to leave the Paris Agreement. And this is critical because the US, for the last 4 years, has tried to establish itself as a leader in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and even finance. But what I believe will happen now is that quite a bit of focus will begin to shift to US cities and US states. California has already signaled its intention to continue US leadership with respect to climate change. This is very similar to what happened the last time President Trump was in office. So we expect a little bit of a repeat. But it's really going to be critical, particularly within the context of climate finance. And that's important because the Caribbean in particular, led by the Honorable Mia Mottley, is leading work on climate finance through the Bridgetown Initiative. Right? And this is where we're really trying to get the Bretton Woods institutions, particularly the MGGs, to reform climate finance, to really begin to think deeply about the fact that we are grappling with surviving hurricanes, more intense hurricanes and more frequent hurricanes. We really shouldn't be doing that with loan finance, and with loan finance that where the cost of capital is unjustly high. So I think this is going to become important because the influence of the US on these institutions will be critical if the US wishes to establish leadership within the realm of climate finance. And just remember that the last time President Trump was in office, he took the decision to appoint someone from the United States of America to lead the IDB, a role that was traditionally held by someone from Latin America, right? These types of moves, I mean, particularly if they're repeated, they're going to become very important if the US wants to establish leadership with respect to climate finance, right? Because that's going to be a key tenet for the Caribbean moving forward, particularly as we try to move institutions and countries away from away from loans and towards concessionary finance. The final component of this that I want to touch on tonight is whether or not, as many of us believe, leaving the Paris Agreement will lead to less ambition. And as mentioned by Professor Byron, drill baby drill, if that would really result in increased emissions and increased production of oil and gas from the USA, and what will the impact of funding for climate adaptation and resilience and mitigation be? Of course, many of us suspect that funding will be reduced for climate mitigation and adaptation and resilience, but the truth of the matter is we don't know. The rhetoric may not match the policy, so we really have to wait and see, right? But we do expect emissions to increase, particularly if oil and gas production is going to increase. But again, even that we have to wait and see because we do not know to what extent carbon will be captured. But again, with deregulation on the table, hope for that is I think being diminished. The second key axis is a more aggressive posture towards Cuba, Venezuela, and China, which several of my colleagues touched on earlier. This is going to be really important because Marco Rubio has been nominated for the Secretary of State position. And for those of you from Trinidad and Tobago, as I am, you remember, or should remember, that in July 2019, Mr. Rubio took to X, formerly Twitter, to mention that the US and Trinidad and Tobago has an excellent and growing relationship, but our Ministry of Energy was helping Cuba to circumvent sanctions related to Venezuela through the shipment of LPG via a third party. And he mentioned that would be an unnecessary irritant in our bilateral relationship. Having someone that's going to become a Secretary of State call out Trinidad and Tobago in particular for what he sees as our role in helping Cuba to circumvent sanctions is an interesting stepping stone for what we think we're about to see. Right? We think we're going to see more strident relationships between the US and Cuba and Venezuela. And I think many CARICOM nations, as mentioned by Professor Byron, want to see a cooling of the relationship between Cuba and the US. That is unlikely to happen. But as relates to Venezuela, Venezuelan claims to Guyana take on new meaning now within the context of climate energy and climate politics, particularly now as the US has significant energy interest and investments in Guyana that they want to protect. Right. And so Venezuela, we should also mention, and again, the last speaker touched on this, I'm not going to touch on it very long. Venezuela is particularly important to Trinidad and Tobago because of our unitization agreement. Our country would like to get as much gas as we can from those fields. We want that gas landed in Trinidad and Tobago. That is beginning to look less and less likely. What we expect, and again, we'd have to wait and see if Senator Rubio's or if he becomes Secretary Rubio, and if his former statements are anything to go by, posture towards Venezuela and Cuba is likely to become more aggressive. Which leads me now to just touch on China very briefly, because China, and in particular Chinese companies, are key investors in our region, and in particular in energy companies in the Caribbean, particularly in oil and gas companies. But not just that, China is also a key supplier of sustainable energy and technology globally and in the Caribbean. And China is also a key provider of climate finance via its Belt and Road Initiative. So, similar to our position with the Bretton Woods institutions, the Caribbean is going to be pushing for more concessionary finance and less loans. So, again, as mentioned by the previous speaker, there is already talk of a new Cold War, particularly with China. And as this emerges, the people of the Caribbean need to be united and need to be clear. We are not pawns, and we are not focused on choosing a new world leader. We are focused on our development, and that has to be our focus. The third axis that I need to touch on is the weaponization of tariffs, right? Now, there are going to be several impacts in terms of weaponization of tariffs. The first direct impact is, well, twofold. One, if we do indeed run afoul of US foreign policy, as implied by Rubio in 2019, we may be subject directly as individual nations to tariffs because tariffs have been weaponized in the way that they are now. But more than that, the second part of that is that we don't know how Trump 2.0 will impact the CBI, the Caribbean Basin Initiative, or the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act. We have no idea what's going to happen there, right? And so that's going to become important, right? Again, the role of the WTO in kind of helping to navigate this is also going to become interesting because, again, we seem to be heading towards another age of unilateralism, right? And I think as a Caribbean people and as persons from small states, we have to press in the other direction. We have to press towards multilateralism, and we have to do that together. The second part of this is the indirect impact of the weaponization of tariffs. And that's primarily going to be in the form of trade diversion. When a Caribbean enterprise is using the US as a transshipment point to get its products, and the country it's getting it from has been hit with tariffs, they might need to find new suppliers. They may need to find new businesses that to get their goods to manufacture products in the Caribbean. And in fact, and this is the real problem, right? When tariffs are used as weapons, when trade is diverted, actors that were not competitive before may become competitive now, and actors that were competitive before may not be competitive with us now, right? And so we are going to have to make sure that we are alert, right, and responsive to global trade norms as they change. I have to point out, right, for those of you that study this area, this is precisely why Jagdish Bhagwati, one of the scholars in this area, opposed free trade areas and opposed preferential trade agreements in the first place. He said it can become very complex. It can become a situation where he defined it where trade relations become somewhat of a spaghetti bowl, hard to really navigate. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. The de facto reality may very well be more complexity and more barriers. And none of that is good for us. Why is all of this important? And what does it have to do with energy and climate change? But all of this is happening within the context of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that's going to be put in place by the European Union. We have no idea. And let's be clear, that's both a trade and climate policy. We have no idea how Trump and his administration will respond to the CBAM, right? What we know is this, that it's very likely that the war between Russia and Ukraine will end. When that happens, it is very likely that Russian gas and Russian ammonia and other downstream industries, which, by the way, if you're from the Caribbean, matters to you, and particularly from Trinidad and Tobago, we produce a lot of ammonia, that would matter to you. But in particular, if those products are allowed back into the global market as they were before, right? If they come fully back on stream, that has trade impacts for us, right? But we also don't know what Trump's original response to the CBAM will be. We don't know what the lifting of domestic regulations in the United States will mean. Because again, through institutions like the DOGE, like one of the former speakers mentioned, the Department of Government Efficiency. Trump and his team have spoke about cutting red tape, removing regulations a lot. They spoke about it a lot. For the energy sector, that could also mean bringing several plants that are already planned and are already in the works to fruition. And several of those plants are ammonia plants in the US. And if those get greenlit, and if the so-called red tape is removed, we may face new competition from closer sources, right? And again, one of the things that those entities would have had to address before, particularly for Biden, would have been CBAM. We don't know what the response to CBAM is going to be. And the last thing, of course, is our own domestic gas supply. And our own downstream industries would have to respond to CBAM individually as well, right? And again, all I said before about trade diversion also applies. So we really need to examine what the impact of Trump will be on trade policy as it relates to the things that we produce within the region, particularly our energy exports, right? And in closing, I'd say this. We will need to examine what the response to the Trump regime will mean for the reduction of greenhouse gases and for a transition to sustainable energy. Right? Both of those issues are critical to Caribbean smaller developing states. Make no mistake, even though Trump might say drill baby drill, the US also can earn a lot of money from sustainable energy. So it's not, I don't expect Trump to be anti US energy, US energy companies entering to the sustainable energy market. That could be good for the Caribbean, but we are going to have to raise all of these issues vigorously with the Trump team when they enter into office next month, and also at the Summit of the Americas in the Dominican Republic next year. Thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Niles, for this very comprehensive, but bringing all the different aspects. You brought in trade, you were talking about environment and climate, but you showed us the connections between that and other important elements and factors. Thank you for that. There is not much time for a long conversation, unfortunately. The discussion was rich, and now we will have time just for a few questions. I think just 2 rounds, because we only have 15 minutes, after which we will close. You know, the question I had, I had posed my own question even before the seminar started, and I'm pleasantly surprised that all the panelists addressed the matter of agency, Caribbean agency, because, you know, we sometimes see ourselves as defenseless, and of course, we understand the obstacles and the hindrances, but many of you have identified how we can navigate this very complex and very difficult environment. We spoke about collective engagement, the use of the diaspora, you know, having representation, the necessary and quality representation. So I thank you for that. But I have a follow-up question, which is, considering the current system that we are in and our past experiences and the results that we have obtained, I'm just wondering, each of the panelists, what do you think, how far do you think those recommendations that you have made could go in bringing about a bigger shift or a more fundamental change in the way things have done before? So I open the floor to you. If each of you very briefly could tell me, how far do you think those recommendations can go to make a bigger change or a more fundamental shift in the status quo?
If I may, and by way of preamble, thank you so much for including me in this webinar. It has been really, I think, of the highest quality, and my compliments to all of my fellow panelists. I don't think we're going to see a fundamental change. I think that the next administration's priorities are already pretty clear. But I would highlight just one or two things. One, I think we need to focus on the fact that for the first time, there's going to be a Latino Secretary of State. And he has a long record of concern or engagement in the region. And I think that's something that CARICOM generally and the region, including non-CARICOM states, all need to pay close attention to. I don't, to very quickly touch on a comment from our last speaker, Dr. Niles. I don't think that Mr. Trump is necessarily going to abandon all of the initiatives that we've seen originating in the Biden administration. But I do think, as several of my colleagues have suggested, that things could become very transactional. And that the new administration will be particularly concerned with initiatives that could generate economic growth. The last thing I would say, and I less as a former American diplomat than as a fellow in the Caribbean Policy Consortium, I think my colleagues are correct that the Caribbean strength lies in its ability to work together. But I note that CARICOM does not always and uniformly work together. But clearly, CARICOM in the aggregate is going to have a greater, if you will, a louder voice in the region's affairs than the individual states are likely to have.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that. And we move to Professor Byron. Professor Byron, you may comment on something one of the panelists said, and then you could respond to the question about how far do you think what you have proposed can go in making things different, or if at all.
I think that some of what we did today was to comprehensively discuss worst case scenarios, but of course hope that things will not become as bad as they could get. And other things, I know in my case, I was trying to focus on what the Caribbean can do to help itself, to increase its resilience and its ability to respond internally from our own resources to some of the situations that we might face, so that our societies are not overcome by various scenarios that could develop. I believe that our positioning and our relationship with the United States represent considerable opportunities for us. But I do not think that as we go into the coming age, where there are a number of emerging major economic powers, a number of emerging technological powers, that as small developing countries with a clear understanding of our interests, that we should limit our major relationships just to the United States. And I think that we should continue to explore within the realm of what is possible, and hopefully that we should approach this as regionally as we can. We should explore how we can continue to collaborate and to derive benefit from other partnerships as well. Because a lot of what I have heard being discussed it might not be as bad as it appears to be, but it more seems to me that, the proposals at the moment are that everybody should subsidize the United States, rather than continue to look after one's own development. And frankly, in our case, we have to continue to pursue development cooperation that enables us to look after our own societies and our own people on a regional level. That's my concern.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Professor Griffith, we have about 4 minutes remaining, so if you could comment in about a minute on the question or the comment, I would greatly appreciate it.
Well, I'm going to use my 2 Guyanese minutes to make one comment.
Guyanese minutes.
And it's a comment about an issue that has been resonating among most of the panelists, and that's the issue of immigration. I've got a good friend at Miami Herald, Jackie Charles. Just before I got on the show, Jackie sent me an article that she was just released. Here's the headline. Bahamas, Turks and Caicos tell Trump they will not be dumping grounds for U.S. deportees. I think the bilateralism, transactional arrangements, and the likely drama in regard to that on immigration has begun. Because if you read Jackie's article, both the Bahamian government and the Turks and Caicos government have come out with strong statements saying that we will not be taking people who you just tell us. Partly the Trump team has put out a statement saying they're going to send deportees to Panama, to Grenada, to the Bahamas, to Turks and Caicos. And Bahamas and Turks and Caicos said, no, we're not going to be taking your deportees. So I think as we are mindful of the whole panoply of issues, I think we've begun to see the stage setting for the transactional, for the bilateral, and I would suspect that those 4 countries named will be increased to more than 4. In addition to the saga with regard to Haiti issue of migration and immigration, saga has just begun. But let me just say, since I have 30 seconds Guyanese time left, all of what we've talked about here can be academic only if the policy elites in the Caribbean, diplomatic and political, don't listen to us or hear us or act on what we say. We can articulate, but they have got to be mindful of their articulation and do something about it.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that. Your 2 minutes, Guyanese time. Very well spent. Dr. McDonald, you have any last words?
I
If you
will
want to
take
comment on the question or comment on somebody's presentation, feel free to do so.
I will take a New York minute and be very quick. I was going to say one aspect of everything we've talked about in terms of the Trump 2.0 and policies is unintended consequences. What may be meant as a blow against China may rebound in the Caribbean. And the deportation issue, the target there is Mexico. It's not Jamaica, it's not Trinidad, but it raises big questions as to how does that work out? And it's not clear. The other aspect is the language is going to change, but I think the overarching strategic goal for the U.S. Wants a stable Caribbean. They want things to work. So that aspect of things I think is very important to emphasize. And I'd say 2 really quick points to Dr. Niles. The U.S. has invested a massive amount of money into renewable energy. The Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS, we're talking about $1.5 to $2 trillion that have gone into it. And if you look at a map where battery factories, EV production is set up, it's awfully top heavy in red states. You're going to have a lot of governors, Republican governors, that are not going to want to watch this cut off at the knees. The last point I would make is I don't think we're in an era coming up of unilateralism. I think it's competitive multilateralism. The US is still number 1, but being number 1 really doesn't mean what it used to mean. And the US ability to impose everything on everybody else, it's just not the same as it was, let's say, in the 1970s or during the Cold War. Those days are over. And China is a competitor. Russia is a competitor. Europe, India's merging. Look at the BRICS and Brazil. All those countries have a larger profile in how things get done. And they're not going to meekly go back to their tent and say, okay, Mr. Trump, everything goes your way. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. McDonald. So I'm happy that we have highlighted and we're emphasizing that all is not lost. Professor Barron said it, all the other speakers said it as well, Professor Griffith, Ambassador to you, Dr. Niles, that there are opportunities. You know, the US needs the Caribbean to be safe, to be doing well economically. So these are things that we could think about as we think about our agency and how we navigate the relationship. Thank you for saying this again. And I also want to highlight something I think that came out in Dr. Niles' presentation and tied to what the other presenters said about how we act collectively at the regional level, but what we should do and how we should be promoting multilateralism as well as a twin strategy to navigate this the current environment. So finally, we get a word from Dr. Niles, and then we will go to Professor Griffith to give the closing remarks. Dr. Niles?
Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks for the reflections from my fellow panelists as well. Certainly, I don't know if I implied, but I certainly don't believe that it's going to go from 0 to 100, as in we're going to see a total like change of 180 overnight. I think the overarching point that I'm trying to make here is the landscape is more complex in several ways, and we don't know what's going to happen. But what we do need to be is prepared, right? And so we need to prepare for the very worst scenario, which is unlikely, but we also need to prepare with our own development objectives in mind. And that to me is critical. I really like the framing of the competitive multilateralism, Dr. McDonald. And that's why I made the point when I was trying to close off that the US also has significant investments in renewable energy and sustainable energy. I didn't want to open a new can of worms near the end of my speech, but I wanted to also make the point that one of Donald Trump's closest allies or supporters or financiers is Elon Musk, who, I mean, is producing electric vehicles and solar panels, and it's not exactly shy about renewable energy, right? And again, I know that the red states have significant investments in this as well. I think the message coming from a lot of what I'm hearing from US technocrats and US scholars is that what Trump is trying to say is that the US is open for business, and business in some ways to displace competition from other parts of the world as well. You know what I'm saying? And also to invite some of those competitive forces into the US, i.e., a number of those Chinese manufacturers, solar panel manufacturers, for example, are being invited into the US to set up bases and have already done so, right? And that's important. That's also important for our region. Because just one example with this, and then I'll close off, is Trinidad and Tobago at one point was trying to manufacture solar panels within our borders. And we were also trying to court investors. We are still trying to do that, in theory. But this is my point now. This is my point. As we move forward, we also need to be open for business. But not just open for business, we need to be open for our development. Right? We need to be open to development. And that means that we have to engage strategically with all of our partners, not just the US. We need to engage strategically with China. We need to engage strategically with all of the BRICS nations. We need to engage strategically with Europe. We need to engage strategically with, by the way, with whom we have a significant and large trade agreement. And finally, we need to engage very strategically with the United States government. Doing that within the realm of weaponized tariffs, that's the picture I'm trying to paint. But I think we're up for it. And I think and I'll end by echoing what Professor Griffith said. we could talk until the cows come home. Our advice needs to be heeded. And we need to fix what we refer to politely as our implementation deficit. We need to turn some of these thoughts into actions. I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nels. We have been given permission for an extra few minutes. So in light of that, I think I'm going to take 1 or 2 questions from the chat, after which, Professor Griffith, we could close. All right, so we have several questions, and one of them is directed at Professor Griffith. The question says, regarding your point about CBSI, how do you square the projection of reduced emphasis on regional security, given that the world is a more volatile place in 2024 than it was in 2016 to 2020? That was specifically for you, Professor Griffith.
Thank you to the questioner for the question. I don't know that there is any reduced emphasis on regional security. As a matter of fact, in the Caribbean context, there is a recognition of the need to enhance regional security. If you take some of the architecture for security in the Caribbean that go back to Cricket World Cup 2007, and you look at the expansion of the CARICOM impacts, you look at the emphasis on beyond the traditional military law enforcement, you see the increasing importance of security and the architectures for security. I anticipate that in the context of that growing emphasis on regional security, cybersecurity will be a more significant element in the matrix going forward. My worry is that given the capability limitations of CARICOM countries to deal with the increasing regional security domain, and given a fairly reliant contribution, notwithstanding the diminished contributions to CBSI from the United States, there is going to be a stalling of the pursuit of enhancement of regional security. If there's evidence of Trump 1.0 being played out in Trump 2.0.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. And we have another question from our audience that says, what role do Caribbean American communities in the US play in shaping election narratives and voter turnout during the 2024 elections? And in line with one of the recommendations from this webinar is we can extend that to what role can they play, post-elections in advancing or promoting Caribbean interests. So any of the panelists, feel free to respond to that question. Or if there is more than one, that is fine. What are your thoughts?
One very brief comment. I think generally speaking, many of the ethnic communities in the United States have significant influence, particularly on the state level in regional affairs. I believe that the Dominican Republic has been particularly effective in the last 20 years at reminding Washington-based policymakers that they are present and that their community is active and votes. So I'm not sure what the role was in the most recently concluded election, but I am a firm believer in the importance and the potential potency of groups such as the Caribbean diaspora to have an effect on U.S. policymakers.
Thank you, Ambassador Duddy, for that. And I'll ask one last question from our audience. And the question is, what approach, if any, does the panel think the Trump administration will take to Caribbean international financial centers? Will he target them like Obama did? Or is there scope, given his business-minded approach, that he'll be more willing to support us on issues such as de-risking? Anybody wants to take that? Dr. McDonald, or anybody else?
I'll take a stab at it. I would say
Thank
there's
you.
a couple things on the table. I think it's going to be very hard to reverse the de-risking that was done by the banks, US, Canadian, European banks. Did a lot of damage, but having worked for a regulatory agency, a bank regulatory agency, the momentum to change things around is very difficult. I think on a transactional basis, yeah, I don't think the Trump administration is going to go after Caribbean international financial centers the way the Obama administration did. But I do think that when you end up with the recent issues that occurred in the Bahamas, I don't know if anybody read the news in the Bahamas, but big scandal. Members of the police were high-ranking members of the police were involved in trafficking in cocaine with Colombians. There's a New York, was a Southern District of New York case that's against them. Those things incur interest. They make people look closer and they raise questions, even if, I think the Caribbean's done a lot to de-risk from money laundering. They don't get the credit for it. And I would say the biggest scandals that have occurred over the last 5 years have been places like Sweden and Denmark, Estonia. But that said, when you have something like what just occurred in the Bahamas, it focuses unwelcome attention and negative headlines to the issue. But I don't think you're going to see the Trump administration go after international financial centers in the Caribbean.
Thank you, Dr. McDonald. At this point, I'm going to turn over to Professor Griffith, partner of this webinar, and to provide closing remarks and to thank everyone who participated and who contributed to this webinar. Professor Griffith?
Thank you, Dr. Montoot. We've been talking a lot about a gentleman whose first name is Donald. But I want to take us back 2 decades to another gentleman whose first name was Donald. This is a guy called Donald Rumsfeld. And Donald Rumsfeld, in serving as defense secretary during the Iraq War, made famous a proposition which I want to invoke in framing my closing remarks. He talked about there being known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. So our conversation here has been about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And it would be useful, I think, in the context of these known, unknown, and unknown unknowns, for us to come back a year from now and have a conversation to see to what extent some of the prognostications in regard to the unknown unknowns, whether some of the skepticism about the known unknowns really have panned out. But between now and then, let me take the opportunity to thank everyone who has been participant in the preparation and execution of this excellent, I think, webinar. I don't have an opportunity to name all the individuals, but I want to single out a few individuals. Ms. Arian Kane at the Institute of International Relations, Wendy Maynard, Janet Carew of the marketing and UWI-TV. Thank you and your teams for the splendid job in helping us in the context of our being in different time zones in particular. None of this could have happened, the conversation we had about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns could not have happened without an excellent input by the panelists. I want to extend personal and institutional thanks to Patrick and Jessica and Scott and Karen. But let me also enable us to appreciate the role of the participants, the attendees, the contributors to the success, the individuals who took the time to register the individuals who took the time to spend the 2 hours or part of the 2 hours with us. I thank you all for your contribution to this conversation about things that are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Griffith, and thank you to everyone.